1 year ago, Daggerheart was released, and it's been met with some great commercial and critical success. And through all of the discourse over the last year, I haven't seen a particular thing talked about in relation to this role-playing game. And I think this one aspect of its design bears focus on, and there's something here we can learn from as game designers ourselves. Because whether or not you watch Critical Role or even enjoy this type of role-playing game, every game has a lesson to teach us, something we can extract and learn from, whether for better or worse. And that's what this series of videos is about. These are the learning from videos where I take a look at a particular tabletop game or video game and try to glean a single useful aspect that then we can apply in our own designs. Hi, I'm Peter, creator and lead designer of Tales from Elsewhere, and this video is not going to be skipping a stone across the surface of design. This is going to be a plunge into very philosophical and theoretical aspects of game design. So let's roll up our sleeves, open up Excalidraw, and let's see if we can get to the bottom of the domain structure in Daggerheart. For those that may not be familiar, in Daggerheart, most of what a character can actively do is determined by the domain cards they have access to. These are actual physical cards that you can pick up when you get the box set, and you can print them online. Now, there are a couple hundred of these, I believe, and each one is a self-contained spell or wondrous ability or tactical option or role-playing beat. And what determines which domain cards you can access is based on your class. Each class is the combination of 2 domains. And there are 9 domains in total in the, at least, first book in the Daggerheart system. And we don't need to dig into what each of them actually mean at the moment, but they are 9 in total, from Codex, Grace, Midnight Arcana, Sage, Bone, Blade, Valor, and Splendor. Now, these domains aren't character classes themselves, but rather power sources and category of ability that, when put together, create the identity of a class. For example, the Wizard is the combination of Codex and Splendor. The Ranger is the combination of Bone and Sage, so on and so forth. And in the first book, we just have one class for each 2 domain permutation along this ring. And I think this is very cool, and let's unpack what's going on here structurally, narratively, and compare it to some other games and media out there that use similar structures. The reason this is so cool is that it invites participation and imagination from the readers and players of the game. And that's because we can sit here and imagine what other permutations of domains might represent. For example, what is Blade and Codex? Maybe like a spell sword sort of class. Or what is, I don't know, Splendor and Midnight? Is that like a death cleric or a necromancer? We can start to imagine, and this opens the door for homebrewing and game designers to add to this lexicon of classes. Now, what's interesting is that the only classes presented here were the ones in this particular ring of domains. So they didn't present a Codex plus Midnight class, there isn't an Arcana plus Splendor class, but there's nothing to say that they can't add those in the future, and with some of the previews and such coming out that they've announced, they're even adding new domains, like Blood. So, you know, adding a Blood and Blade could be like a Death Knight, right? Adding, or a Blood and Bone, I think is what they're going to have be the Blood Hunter, which was a Matt Mercer created class back in the D&D days. So there's a lot of interesting things that we, as players or GMs or homebrewers, can engage with here, because it's a structure that is at least partially relational. And those relations, those connections, open up possibility for us. And that's very cool. And if you were to compare this to just, say, The magic schools in a game like Dungeons & Dragons, things like evocation and transmutation and abjuration, those aren't relational magical disciplines. They're just buckets that things get put into. And they don't provide an entire cohesive view of all the classes in the game. It is really only for the spellcasters. While here in Daggerheart, every class and every ability one can do is represented via domain cards and the domains that source them. Blade domain cards aren't spells, they're weapon mastery abilities, or Sage might present spells in some cases or abilities in others. These aren't exclusive to just magic. It's placing every character class roughly on the same level of complexity and with the same level of mechanical engagement with the core system, these domain cards and their uses. And I really do think that this is a great example of a cohesive power structure to present your entire game system with. I think too many games partition some types of character classes into other categories or modes of play, and it creates disparities of interest with those classes. Long have I ranted about the martial-caster divide, not necessarily from a balance perspective in modern D&D, but from an interest perspective, from a mechanical depth perspective. And structures like this one in Daggerheart really do away with that core issue. Before we even start talking about balance, all of these classes have similar levels of cool stuff they get to play with. And for that reason, this is a very good structure to take notes on. But let's compare this structure to other examples of relational power sources or magical schools from other media and see if you can start noticing some of the differences that we can learn from as well. So first, we're going to take a look at one of my favorite structures in all of gaming and media when it comes to magic and ability, the Magic the Gathering color wheel. Now, I'm going to assume if you're watching this channel, you have a vague understanding, at a minimum, of the Magic color pie, but if you don't, we're just going to very briefly go over this. There are 5 colors of magic, types of mana, that are each sourced from a different type of land. The white mana comes from the plains, the green from the forests, red from the mountains, black from the swamps, and blue from the islands. Now, these are colors of magic, as well as aspects of identity and aspects of reality, really, within every Magic the Gathering realm. And this is a relational structure in a way that is beyond what Daggerheart has, and let me unpack why. This set of magic is not arbitrarily placed in this order. White mana is in opposition to red and black mana and allied with blue and green. Red mana is in opposition to white and blue and allied with green and black. And they're allied both in a mechanical sense and in a meaning sense and in a narrative sense. So, as an example, red is the color of impulse and chaos and emotion, which is in contrast to blue's rigidity, artifice, and intellect, and also in opposition to white's order and law and stability. So they're ideologically separate. White and blue mana also are, from a mechanical standpoint within the game, they focus on controlling, creating rules, stopping players from action, while red tends to be more explosive and aggressive and equal opportunity in its destruction because it is untamed. And each of the colors has meaning in both their allies and enemies in this way. And this makes it highly relational. In fact, as the game has evolved over the many decades, the identity of both 2 color combinations and 3 color combinations and 4 and 5 color combinations have gained a lot of presence in the worlds of Magic the Gathering. I've read several of the novels, some of them are pretty bad, but I love the Ravnica setting as that's one that really started to define an identity for 2 color combinations, especially enemy colors. And so we can ask ourselves, what is green and black when together? That's an interesting thought experiment. We have life and we have death, we have growth and we have decay, and what does that represent both in a mechanic standpoint and in a narrative standpoint? And that's a really interesting question. It's the Golgari Guild, as presented in Ravnica, which tends to do with life and death as a consistent cycle. It's growth and death, fungus, insects. It is the inescapability of death and the impermanence of death. And all these different combinations have these really cool identities to them. So Magic the Gathering is an excellent example of a relational structure where not only is the placement vital, but the meaning carries a lot of weight, because the Magic the Gathering color wheel is understood within the fiction of the Magic the Gathering worlds. The mages of the world, particularly the planeswalkers, they understand the mana itself. The color wheel exists within that world. Like, these relationships are known, and they're conceptualized using that roughly same language as we would use to describe the game terms. That makes this highly immersive. Another great example from media would be the Avatar: The Last Airbender elements. Now, they use the classical Greek elements, as we'd say, air, earth, fire, and water, but have done some really cool things with them. Now, the 4 elements within the fiction of Avatar are at once at war with each other and in balance with one another. And they, like the Magic the Gathering wheel, are highly relational. The placement along this ring is not arbitrary. Earth is in opposition to air and is allied more with water and fire. And this is actually demonstrated within the show itself, as Avatar Aang, who is an airbender, when he attempts to learn all the elements, he finds water bending comes naturally, fire bending comes naturally to the detriment of his friend's safety, but he really struggles to learn earth bending because the rigidity of earth bending from a psychological standpoint, from a cultural standpoint, is in opposition to the free-spirited and thinking around your problems sort of approach that airbending represents, and air nomad culture represents. Similarly, Avatar Korra, who is a waterbender, she's from the water tribe, she finds air and earth come naturally to her, but fire is a real dill of a pickle for her to master. So like the Magic the Gathering color wheel, these combinations and placement are not only mechanically interesting from a cool power standpoint within the Avatar universe, but are ingrained within the cultures themselves. The people of the world understand and conceptualize this diagram in fiction, diegetically. This is understood to them. And that's really cool. And now the last example I'd like to bring up is our Lord and Savior, hallowed be its name, 4th edition Dungeons & Dragons. So what I'd like to show you is the class table for D&D 4th edition. So for those that weren't there during the sacred times that was the heyday of 4E, every character class was conceptualized with a power source and a role. So roles are leader, defender, striker, and controller, and the power sources were martial, divine, arcane, primal, and psionic, and later a little bit of shadow. Your role represented your role within a team and the aspects of gameplay you'd most engage with. For example, leaders were there to support their allies through buffs or more action economy, and sometimes healing as well. While defenders were there to absorb hits, protect their allies. Strikers were there to do a lot of single target damage and single out opponents. And controllers were there to manipulate the battlefield, provide hazards for their enemies, and various utility abilities. And the way that then those roles were conceptualized were via their power sources. And so a martial leader is a warlord, a very cool class in 4th edition, while a divine leader would be a cleric. And this structure, especially because they only released a handful of classes in their first book, invites participation in the same way that the Magic the Gathering color wheel does, in the same way that the Daggerheart domain ring does. And this was very neat because it let D&D explore new design spaces for classes simply by asking what the permutations would be of these different features. And I remember back in the day, the Marshall controller was this big question mark, and they didn't release like an official one. But one of the common ways people would homebrew this is some sort of trap setter or, scout-like character that's like setting up mines and traps and things, or, has ropes and other tools to interfere with people. But this was very cool, and we can actually see some of the legacy of this in D&D 5th edition and 5.5. For example, the Divine Striker, called the Avenger, still has echoes in the Oath of Vengeance Paladin, as the Avenger could pick a single target and get advantages against that one person, making them their sworn enemy. And we've seen that, like with the Oath of Vengeance Paladin. But like the domains in Daggerheart, the structure of this class table isn't all that relational. It's just very much a list of two unit permutations. And the people of the world in D&D aren't thinking about leader, defender, striker, and controller. Like, they don't use those terms diegetically. They might talk about power sources as sources of magic and power, but you wouldn't be like, oh, that guy over there is a martial defender to describe a fighter. That doesn't really make sense in the fiction of D&D. In the fantasy world, this is a construct of mechanical separation rather than a diegetic explanation about the reality of the world. Now that we've looked at all those examples, can you see the differences here with the domain structure versus some of the ones I've talked about, and where maybe this falls short of something I would prefer but still has a lot of meat to it? So the big difference that I've noticed is that these domains are not truly relational to one another, and they aren't an explanation in fiction. They aren't diegetically understood within the reality of a Daggerheart game, at least by default. And that's not to say that that is bad. This is very much a conscious decision by the design team, because Daggerheart is not a fixed setting. It is a rule structure and a vibe that then gets filtered into campaign frames or whatever homebrew you run at home. Kind of like D&D, where you could not necessarily have to run Faerun or one of my favorites, Greyhawk. You can conceptualize it across the board. And accordingly, these different domains aren't fundamental aspects of reality understood by the characters in the fiction. People don't talk about that a valor power source is how the Guardian is fighting. These are rules constructs that are outside of the game that then inform the actions that characters in fiction are able to do. Now, that's very much juxtaposed against Avatar: The Last Airbender and Magic the Gathering, which I find to be really evocative, because I love when not only are these understood in fiction, but they are relational to one another. Splendor isn't in opposition to Sage and Arcana in any narrative or mechanical way. Grace isn't in opposition to Blade and Bone, nor is it particularly allied with Midnight and Codex in any real way, neither mechanically or, honestly, narratively. These are light thematics, but they aren't relational thematics, and that makes them more versatile. So when you're working on a game, you want to consider that. The more loose association that these have with one another opens the structure up more. It's less rigid than something more concrete like the Magic the Gathering wheel. It means that with a less rigid structure, you can add more domains over time and it doesn't break the wheel. You cannot add new elements, new colors to the Magic the Gathering wheel. It breaks the entire game. Absolutely impossible. And that makes it more rigid. That's not necessarily good or bad. It's a decision you're going to have to make. Do you want something more concrete, relational, and deep from a relational standpoint, right? From a diegetic standpoint? Or would you like something more open, something more versatile, something that allows you to add to it over time or modify it in more substantive ways without feeling like you're breaking prior designs, breaking prior classes? I could add the blood domain to this chart, but it wouldn't really fit in the chart because the chart is purely a rules presentation structure rather than a reflection of reality like the Magic the Gathering wheel is. Get what I'm saying? You see kind of the differences here? I think regardless of which one of these you go with or which one you think is the most effective structure, what I'd really like you to take away from this, from Daggerheart and from all of these systems, is that these sort of relational structures with a diagram or permutations is much more effective from top to bottom than arbitrarily placed abilities. That's not to say that arbitrarily placed abilities aren't interesting or evocative, but when you utilize a structure like any of these, it's grounding the classes and their abilities and the things people do into a cohesive concept, to a unified theory about how the game structure functions. And if you go very deep, like Avatar or Magic the Gathering, it also ends up being a reflection of the people of the world itself. And that grounds even further these character classes into the cultures, beliefs, and understanding diegetically. And that's very powerful. But again, no matter which end of this you end up on, consider conceptualizing your character classes, special abilities, and so forth with some sort of relational permutation that reveals an interesting space to the readers, to the players and GMs and homebrewers to engage with. And that's why these sort of things get latched onto so powerfully. It's why I think Daggerheart has such a blossoming, burgeoning homebrewing community out there, because there's so much space to play in that has precedent given by the system. I hope you found that interesting. It's something that I love thinking about as a big Magic the Gathering player. And if you have other examples, whether from movies, comic books, video games, wherever, of these sort of relational structures that are interconnected in a brain-tingly way, let me know in the comments below, and consider hitting the like button, maybe subscribing so you can catch the next video. We post a new one of these every other week, and it's always some erudite and heady sort of discussion that I just would be ranting about to other people in the Discord server, even if I didn't have a YouTube channel. So, as always, hope to see you here next time on Tales from Elsewhere.